their client. They said we were just trying to bring them down. We weren't. We were just trying to save lives. We weren't trying to recover from a crisis. We were trying to prevent another crisis. Well, of course, that was the huge news. These two companies locked in, and now the supplier has fired their biggest client. I'm happy to say that nobody died that summer because of this problem. And had one person died, you would have known about it. Because the media, every time they heard about an SUV rollover, they sent crews out. Oftentimes it was a Suburban or a Jeep Wrangler or something like that. 5 months after we announced this, we got fired, Jack Nasser and I. I got to put things in perspective, though, to be honest. After we got fired at 4:30 in the afternoon, Jack said, come over to my place, and he had a condo on the TPC golf course across the street from Ford Motor Company headquarters. And then the administrative assistants came and joined us. We were having wine, and Jack was pouring bottles of wine that was more than my annual income. And people were crying. I wasn't crying. And some of the top executives came over. And I had a glass of wine, or 7, I can't remember. No, I had a glass of wine, and about 8:30, I decided I better go home. And I pulled into the garage, and as I got out of the car, my little 8-year-old daughter, Lane, opened the door. She goes, "What happened today, Dad?" I go, "I got fired." She goes, "Does that mean you can take me to school tomorrow?" And I go, "Yes, it does. Yes, it does." There was one episode in there that tells you how dastardly it can become and why taking things out of context can be very dangerous and hurtful. Early and after we were fighting each other, in the early stages after the first recall, I got a call from Lisa Stark at ABC News, and she was a friend of mine. And she'd been covering this story every day. She goes, "Jason, I have the smoking gun." I go, "What smoking gun?" She goes, "I have the test of the Explorer tires before the Explorer went into production, and the tread separated in the testing out in California." And I'm going, "Oh my God." I said, "Would you fax that to me?" And she did, much to her credit. Sometimes journalists say, "No, I'm not going to fax you this." She faxed it to me, and I looked, it was 26 pages. Cal Test was the name of the company out in California, and sure enough, they'd been testing a bunch of tires, and there was this 14-inch Firestone tires tread separation in the testing. I was like, oh my God. So I went to our war room with our analysts, and I go, "Ernie, what the hell is this?" He goes, "Give me a few minutes." He was back in my office 10 minutes later. He goes, "You're missing 2 pages. I go, "What?" He said, "You're missing the cover letter." And I said, "What does it say?" He goes, "Here." And in the cover letter, it said they didn't test the 14-inch tires, even though they said they did. They retested 16-inch tires in their place, but they didn't write it correctly. But they noted that in the cover. And I called Lisa Stark back at ABC. I said, "You're missing a few pages. I'll fax them to you." She goes, she got them. She goes, "Oh my God." I go, "I don't know who your source is, but highly unethical and immoral. This is a jerk." You didn't see that story until 2 weeks later. Joe White of the Wall Street Journal calls me. He's a good friend of mine. He goes, "I got the smoking gun." I go, let me guess. Is it 26 pages from Cal Test? He goes, "How do you know that?" I go, "Whoever your source is, they tried to do that to ABC News. Here's the cover pages that you're missing." That's what you're dealing with sometimes. People that like to lie. One of the things that is really important is trying to get in front of a crisis. And I keep telling my clients that when you're in a crisis, it's really hard to make good decisions. So whenever your companies you go to or whatever organizations, be prepared for a crisis in advance so that when you get into the crapper, you know how to act. That's how Ford survived, because we knew what decisions to make and what not to make. The last chapter of What Did Jesus Drive asked a question. And this, of course, I wrote it came out in November of 2014. So I finished writing in October, September of 2014. And it discussed the General Motors ignition switch crisis. How many people know about the ignition switch issue? Here's what happened. How much time do I have left? My watch stopped working. I'll keep going. What happened was in the Saturn Ion and the Chevy Cobalt, they're one of their smallest cars. What they were finding was if you had a lot of keys on your keychain and all the things for, you know, the grocery store and CVS and so forth, if you had too many things on that, because of the torque, it could shut the engine off. And when that happened, the airbags were disabled. Power steering was disabled. And it was happening way too often, and unfortunately, the people that drove those cars were primarily young people. And no offense, but young people are the crappiest drivers in the world. People think old people, no, old people go too slow to be crappy. But most of the accidents have to do with people 16 to about 25 years old. That's why, for the most part, rental car companies don't like to rent to people under 25 years old. Sorry. But this was happening to these young people who didn't know how to handle it. Quite frankly, I don't know if a 40-year-old would know how to handle it when you're going 60 miles an hour on a curvy road and suddenly you can't steer. And then they'd have a wreck and the airbag wouldn't deploy. General Motors knew this was happening. At least somebody at General Motors knew this was happening. In fact, it happened to test drivers at their proving grounds. They could handle it because they're test drivers. So the deaths started racking up. But the engineer or engineers saw the problem and they fixed it. They fixed it going forward. So all the cars after the fix, moving forward, they fixed. But for the millions of cars that had been produced before, they did nothing. And then, to make matters worse, and this is a sign of a cover-up, they didn't change the part number. General Motors in particular, and all the companies are like this, they like to change part numbers on a whim because they get to go back to their supply base and say, all right, I need a 10% cost reduction. This is a new part. But they didn't change the part number, which made it impossible to track which cars had the good, which cars had the bad. And they didn't admit this until last year, early last year. So they've got this headache on their hands. They may face criminal charges. Somebody might go to jail, or some people may go to jail. But in the end, this is going to cost General Motors billions, maybe more than $10 billion. Once again, remember the first guiding principle I said? Safety and satisfaction of your customers is paramount. Well, the safety and satisfaction of their customers was dead last, at least with a couple people in the company. And in that chapter in the book, I also talk about Volkswagen. How many people are aware of the scandal inside Volkswagen? Yeah, that's a pretty good percentage of the people that know. This one's different, but in some ways it's more insidious. No one is going to die because GM cheated on their emissions. No one's going to die. They don't make enough cars to affect the global planet. There are some advocates that say people are going to get asthma. That's BS. It's not going to happen. Not going to happen. It's just too much atmosphere. Could suck up 10 times that. I mean, a volcano going off was 10 times more than what all the VW engines produced during this time frame. However, it's not like they had a defect. They cheated the system, and they cheated it systematically throughout their organization. It's not one person knew. It was, we're going to do this. I remember talking to Bob Lutz, who was the vice chairman of General Motors and considered one of the product gurus in the auto industry. He said when VW was meeting the standards for these diesel engines, and his guys couldn't do it, he was pissed. He goes, "Why is VW that much smarter than we are? How are they meeting the standard and we can't do it?" Well, now we know. They were cheating. After it was announced what had happened, as it had been revealed by the U.S. government, their chairman of Volkswagen resigned. And being the chairman of VW is kind of like one of the two top prizes in the world in the auto industry. So you knew it was serious. They've let a lot of people go. The head of the U.S. market, just resigned, fired last week. And in the end, I've talked to a couple of analysts. In the end, this could cost Volkswagen more than $70 billion. Whether it's fines, they could be fined by the U.S. government as much as $30 billion. There are class action suits against them because what did they not do? They didn't put the safety and satisfaction of the customers first. They decided to cheat. And cheating isn't building a bad product. It's willfully deceiving your customer, the regulators, everyone. You know, it's funny. I think in my mind, it came out during Watergate. The notion that the mistake you make isn't your biggest problem. It's the cover-up. And we've seen a cover-up at Volkswagen. We've seen a cover-up at Takata, the airbag company. We saw a cover-up for a while at General Motors. Cover-ups kill. And that is, if it can't get in your head, and you think, we learned that from Watergate. Richard Nixon probably would have still been president had they not had the cover-up, because what they had was a third-rate burglary. What happened in Iran-Contra with Reagan was far worse than anything Nixon ever did, but he got up there and said, hey, the buck stops with me. And everybody forgave him. I've got my new book, and this one has an incentive. I've got a few copies here. My new book carries on the theme of why we lie. I was a political columnist for the Detroit News. They started a political website back in 2010. And the editor, Henry Payne, was a friend of mine, and he said, I need your humor in the column. I go, how often do you want me to write? He goes, whenever you want. I want satire. I go, how much does it pay? He goes, nothing. I go, excellent. Just write down my line. So I came up with my pen name, The Wisecracker, 2 words. And I started my journalistic career there. And once or twice a week, I'd write a column, mostly about politics. And my first column was on the Detroit Public Schools chairman of the board, they'd identified in the news previously that he was illiterate. So the president of the Detroit Public School Board is illiterate. Okay. 2 months later, he was forced to resign because he was fondling himself in front of a female superintendent. As they say, you can't make this up. I called the scandal Mastergate in my first column. And the media in Detroit went nuts, and I got 4 columns out of Mastergate. I also called him the Mad Hander, and it was just too delicious. And then I got a particular column out, and when my editor wrote it, he says, this has to be the name of your book when you put your columns together. And my new book that just came out a couple months ago is Jimmy Hoffa Called My Mom a Bitch. Profiles in Stupidity. Now, while my first book, What Did Jesus Drive, as I said, you have to read the whole thing to kind of figure out, oh, I get why he called it that. This one, you don't have to read the whole thing. You read the intro. And the intro starts, even though there's a lot of satire here, the intro starts on a sad note. Do you remember January 2011, down in Tucson, Arizona, Gabby Gifford, the congresswoman, was shot in the head, and Dallas Green, the former baseball manager's granddaughter, was killed and one of her staffers was killed by this nut job. And President Obama came down to Tucson 2 days later for the memorial. And although I am a rabid Republican, I wrote a column and I said it was his best speech of his tenure. I thought it was fantastic. And in it, he called for a new era of civility in politics. And I thought, yippee, I'm all for that. Well, that didn't last very long. 9 months later in Detroit, Michigan, it's the annual Labor Day rally in downtown Detroit. It's been going on for probably 75 or 80 years. All the Teamsters and the UAW workers, and there tens of thousands are in downtown Detroit. And on the stage, are President Obama and James P. Hoffa Jr., the head of the Teamsters. Jimmy Hoffa's little boy. And he's whipping up the crowd, and he's talking about getting the Tea Party and the Republicans, and he finally just do a fever pitch. He goes, "We got to take these sons of bitches out." Whoa, so much for civility. Then Obama gets up there and didn't say anything like, "Hey, chill out, Jimmy." So I've been thinking that night going, take these sons of bitches out. He goes, wait a minute. He's talking about me. I'm an SOB. Wait a minute. Jimmy Hoffa just called my mom a bitch. So I sent my column into Henry, and it was, because it's a family newspaper, it was Jimmy Hoffa called my mom a what? He goes, this has got to be the title of your book. It's a fun read. It's one of those great reads where you can read it for 15 minutes and put it down. I'm a guy, so I put it down by the toilet and then read it a few minutes later. My favorite column is Globe. It's about Al Gore when he allegedly molested a masseuse in a Portland hotel. True story. Global warming gets rubbed the wrong way. It's a really good one. It's a little bit about Detroit, not much. It's mostly national politics. Lots of stories. The opening chapter is Stupid Perverts. That's Al Gore, the Al Gore, and Mastergate. Anthony Weiner, who was just, he gave me so much material. I love that man. The last two chapters were No Hiding the Wiener, and then the last story is Pop Goes the Wiener. So it's a fun read. And we're going to start a Q&A right now. And I love Q&A, and there's a benefit of this Q&A, because if you ask me a question, I will give you a free copy of my book, signed, which means it's completely worthless. Anybody have a question? Yes, sir. I'm going to, all right, great. I was going to be Phil Donahue, but they don't know who Phil Donahue is.
Sorry, I didn't mean to get in the way.
So with all the scandals that you've mentioned with all these car companies, would you recommend any of us here to actually work for these car companies, knowing their background in lies and scandals?
That is a great question, and without any exception, I would encourage anybody to work for the auto industry. The auto industry is an incredibly noble industry on a financial scale, as far as disclosure and everything. They're the top drawer. And I hate really sometimes when people, and I call them scandals, when people calls them scandals. I told reporters, Ford's not in a scandal on this. Yeah, it's a crisis, but it's not a scandal. We tried every day, 24 hours a day, to find the answer. So it's a great learning experience. Great companies. They're doing really well now. They have a tendency to go like this. When times are good, they're really good. When times are bad, they can lose so much money so quick. But they're a vital part of our industry. I'm a Republican who believes in a free market, but I was for the bailout. Because had we let General Motors and Chrysler go down, the whole country would have gone down. We would have gone into a massive depression. And then we'll get one up there.
So all of us